Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Welcome, everybody, to Nightlight. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. We really appreciate your listening and learning and sharing with us as we explore so many different, unique, unbelievably entertaining authors and books. We really appreciate your sharing your time with us, and we understand how precious time is, so we try to give you the best of the best here, and I think we've done just that today for sure. I want to thank first Ken Quiethawk for his amazing intro. You can find him out there on Google. He and his wife Deb are Native American storytellers, and they have done an amazing amount of work to preserve, protect, and share all of the magic that is in this particularly wonderful way of preserving history. But for now, Mark has an incredible author on with him, and they are going to be delving into some very interesting topics. I'm very excited, and I have my paper and pencil out because I'm taking notes right along with the rest of you. So, Mark, it's all yours.
Okay. How are you doing today, Barbara?
Doing very well, thank you.
Yeah, speaking of time, this is what, second show in 12 hours?
Yes.
Yeah. So, our listeners know that we don't do math on Nightlight, except for when Blog Talk doubles my salary and makes it retroactive, and I can still easily calculate my take-home pay.
Yeah, I haven't been given that notice yet, so.
No. Okay. Yeah, I did okay discussing the science behind prehistoric climate change with TR a couple weeks ago. A little nervous about discussing quantum physics, but our guest has made it easy for people like me to understand in his new book, A Burst of Conscious Light. And I think we'll be okay. This is going to be an exciting show. When I was starting out in my radio career about 10 years ago, I was doing behind-the-scenes research for some of the hosts, and that's where I met our guest. When I saw he had this new book coming out, wanted to have Andrew as a guest, so it's finally nice to finally have him as a guest on my show, and just get reconnected with a exciting lecturer. Our guest is Dr. Andrew Silverman. He is a medical doctor with a background in physics. For over 30 years, Andrew has been researching the mind-matter continuum, near-death experiences, and the Shroud of Turin. He is widely recognized as a leading expert on the Shroud. His new book is entitled A Burst of Conscious Light, and it will be available February 11th, next week from today from Inner Traditions and other major bookstores. So welcome, Dr. Andrew Silverman.
Thank you very much for having me on the show. Very pleased to be here.
Oh, yeah. We are thrilled to have you. We have a great combination of where science and religion actually intersect. So before we get into discussing the Shroud of Turin, can you give us an explanation for why you're using quantum physics and not just regular science as the best method to study the Shroud? What's special about quantum physics?
Well, the thing about quantum physics is that it became apparent over 100 years ago to the founders of quantum physics, people like Max Planck and Erwin Schrödinger, that quantum physics itself suggests that mind or consciousness is actually something fundamental, that it's not a product of matter. So the relevance is not so much, people who read the book will see that they don't need a detailed mathematical understanding of quantum physics to approach the book, far from it. What they will see is that evidence brought together from some of these leading minds from the past and some from the present, in fact, including Professor of Physics at Stanford University, Andre Linde, who wrote in his leading physics textbook that he believes that the science itself is showing that we have to take consciousness seriously as being something that is fundamental. That's can't just be a product of a bunch of atoms that are gathered together into cells in certain formations in the human brain. It has to be far more than that. And of course, near-death experiences demonstrate that also, and people's consciousness continues when their brain waves are completely flat.
Okay. Obviously, the title of your book is an extension of theories of quantum physics, like conscious light.
Yeah.
It kind of sounds like a oxymoron, but
yes. In fact, the title was chosen by the publishers, as is often the case. That wasn't actually my original plan for the title, but it was definitely the evidence suggests that the image on the shroud may have been formed by a burst of light, and that light is a product of consciousness. It's because of consciousness, if you like, that it happened. So yeah.
Okay. So all right. So, before we start getting into discussing the shroud, let's look at a few things that you are not saying in your book. Like you're not a paid spokesperson for the Vatican, or you're not. You're being more of an objective reporter.
Well, yeah. In fact, you mentioned earlier whether this could be where science and religion meet, but actually, if you look carefully, there isn't really religion as such in my book. I do refer to the fact that there is a great deal of evidence that the man whose burial shroud the shroud was the historical Jesus of Nazareth, and that the fact that the image formed after he died in a way that is consistent with a possible burst of light that came from his body may in fact be related to how he lived and how his consciousness was disposed through the choices that he made and the lack of limitation or restriction in his thoughts through being selfless, compassionate, and so on. But none of that in it is actually religious as such. That I go
Right.
to great pains to point out that actually, if you look at his words and in such a way as to put to one side the 20 centuries of history that happened after him, when he was actually asked, "What are you doing here in this world?" sort of thing, his response was that his purpose was to bear witness to the truth. Now, truth nobody has a monopoly on truth, and I believe that all of the world's major religions do have truth within them, but none of them owns the truth, and none of them owns him. That they may, wish to represent him, which is a noble thing to try to do, but he in himself never actually, as far as I can tell, in any of what he was recorded to have said, was in any way condoning or saying that there was a necessity for organized religions and hierarchies and different ranks and different uniforms and so on, intermediaries, human intermediaries between people and him. It was more of a case that he actually said very specifically that anything you see, anything I do, you also can do. He was saying that all human beings have limitless potential, and I don't believe he sought to be worshipped or feared. I think he was just giving us a clear insight to understand ourselves and to understand him as a reflection, if you like, of what our full potential could be as human beings.
Yeah, and you do cover, okay, Jesus, does seem to be the best possible candidate for the person whose image is on the shroud. You talk about, you get a couple other candidates, like maybe a couple of the Old Testament prophets or Buddha, but and all the people that have lived, we don't have documentation of too many people who could be responsible for this image. And, we'll get to that. So you're not really being a advocate for any one particular religion. It's just okay. We don't have too many choices of people who could have done this.
Well, the evidence, as you're saying, does suggest that it was Jesus of Nazareth whose image we see on the shroud, and there's forensic evidence that this was a man who had been killed after having been tortured and whipped and crucified and had a cap of sharp objects placed upon his head. There's plenty of evidence from the pollen evidence and so on that this happened in Judea, and it was probably between the years AD or CE 6 and 66 in either March or April, somewhere in Judea in the environs of Jerusalem. It's very difficult to imagine that it was likely to have been someone other than him, and certainly you mentioned Old Testament prophets. I don't think the Romans had started crucifying people back in those days. Right. It was definitely a Roman crucifixion, and also the Buddha, I don't believe is reported to have been crucified. You mentioned him as well. It does appear that the man whose image we see on the shroud seems to be the historical Jesus of Nazareth. There's plenty of evidence for that. Yeah.
Okay, and so as we start working our way closer to discussing the shroud, most of us are very familiar with the 18 98 photo that seems like it's just very prevalent in religious studies. See it all over the place. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of that photo?
Well, at the time, the shroud belonged to the Savoy family in Italy, and they permitted a photographer called Secondo Pia to take a picture of it. The photography had only been around for about 60 or 70 years at that time, and anyone who's sort of seen antique cameras and so on, it was quite a large device, and you had to even until recently, of course, you had to make a negative, and then before digital cameras started and so on, before you make the positive. And of course, those days the negative was a full-sized photograph that was then you made the positive from that. So Secondo Pia, just to go into the background of this, when you look at the shroud, I've actually seen it 3 times at 3 of the expositions. It's actually what you see is a very faint yellowish sepia type image of the man, both front and back, that you can see on the cloth, as well as the bloodstains, and it doesn't look very clear as such. You can just make it out that this is the shape of a man. And it's only when you look at it in photographic negative that suddenly it jumps out at you. This looks like a photograph of a man that's now appears very clear when it's in negative. And it's said that Secondo Pia nearly dropped his photographic plate in shock when he saw the negative, because the negative of the shroud looks like, well, it's black and white, but it looks like a positive of a photograph of a man. And initially, it was doubted. People thought that he would, he'd made up this image, that it wasn't a true photograph. But then, of course, when it was repeated, people found the same phenomenon, that when you take a negative of the shroud, then the negative looks like a positive. And this is, of course, what one would expect if the image had actually formed as a result of a burst of radiant light from the body of the man. And this is also evidenced by the fact that there's what we call distance coding in the image, and that's one of the many points that argues against the possibility of this camera obscura notion, that this was some kind of in quotes medieval photograph. Of course, there were no photographs in medieval times, but even had there been, if it had in some way been formed by reflected light from a dead body, then it wouldn't have the distance coded information, because it would be reflected. The only way you get the photographic negative properties and the distance coding is for the light actually to emanate from the body itself.
Wow. Okay. We're building up to some fascinating information. So, okay, I'm sure that the photographer would have been startled enough to see that image on a negative, and it's still captivating today when we see it, and that's it is on the cover of your book as well. But
yes.
So you said you've been to see the shroud 3 times, and some of your research is drawn from the 1978 exam of the shroud. What was the importance of that 120 hours that researchers had, like unlimited access to it?
It's very important. I mean, we're the rest of us in the Shroud research community are so grateful to those people that did that. Many of them are, of course, still around, such as Dr. John Jackson and Barry Schwartz, the photographer, to whom I'm very grateful for allowing me to print his photographs in the book. And he also has a website called shroud.com, where you'll find most of the historical and scientific evidence regarding the shroud. And so basically what the STURP team went there, and at first they assumed this was just some kind of relic, that they were going to go there and in 5 minutes they'd see the brushstrokes and then they could go back home again. And of course these were the people who were chosen for it. These were sort of scientists and people working for NASA and Los Alamos and so on. These were very expert people, and they went there assuming, before they'd actually looked into the shroud, that this would be a very simple exercise to find how the image formed. And they were completely astonished when they actually looked at it, that it didn't look anything like they were expecting. There were no brushstrokes on there. When you look at it in close up, then if it had been, as people assumed before they'd looked at it, assumed maybe it had been a painted image, then you would have expected to see paint soaking through the cloth. But the only thing that soaks through the cloth is the bloodstains, which they chemically tested and found actually to be blood. But the image of the man is a tiny superficial phenomenon on the very surface fibrils, just 200 nanometers. And to put that into perspective, a nanometer is just 1 billionth of a meter. So this is the thickness of the image is just 1/5000th of a millimeter. And it doesn't consist of anything that's been added to the cloth. There's no chemical that's been stuck there. It's basically a discoloration of some of the fibrils on the outermost surface, similar to the discoloration in paper when it's exposed to sunlight. And chemically, that's described as oxidation and dehydration. And it's the fact that it's similar to what happens from sunlight, I think, that may have led distinguished scientists such as Dr. Paolo Di Lazzaro of the Italian Atomic Energy Institute, the ENEA, in Frascati, to look into the possibility of whether the image might have formed as a result of a burst of ultraviolet light. And they actually found that using ultraviolet lasers, very powerful, very intense, very short burst of ultraviolet light, they could get similar changes just to the outermost surface fibrils. Now, they're not suggesting, in fact, no one sensible is suggesting that the shroud image was formed technologically by lasers. And in fact, we wouldn't be able to do that even now, not even with 21st century technology. It was billions upon billions of watts of power would have been needed to form the image. And we don't have that even today. Now, just to be clear, when we're talking about all those watts, people might wonder, well, if it was so powerful, so much energy, if you like, why is the shroud still there? Why wasn't the whole thing vaporized? And the clue is in the fact that it's a large amount of power rather than a large amount of energy. See, power is basically means in physics the rate of transfer of energy. So the actual total energy doesn't need to be big, but the energy is applied to the cloth in an extremely intense, very, very short burst of energy to form the image.
Okay, and the dimensions of the shroud are, it's like a 14-foot long piece of cloth. How wide is it?
If I remember correctly, it's around 4 feet wide.
Okay, so this from the 1898 negative, and the photos that Barry Schwartz allowed you to publish in your book, they all show that there was this burst of energy, front and back, covering this 14-foot long piece of cloth.
Yes, of course, not everyone agrees about how the image got there, but I make a case in the book that the evidence is consistent with that possibility that it was a burst of radiant light, and to me this is the possibility that makes the most sense. Really, it's the only one that has any empirical evidence to back it up, as strange and outlandish as it might seem that such a thing should happen. The physical evidence does back it up.
Okay, and is it on display just against the wall, or in the church of the cathedral at Turin, or is it just brought out on a special occasion, like Easter or something like that?
It's much rarer than that. It doesn't come out every year. In fact, I think after it came out, when the time that Secondo Pia took the photograph of it in 1898, I think the next expedition after that was in the 1930s. Wow. And then, if I'm not mistaken, then late 1970s, which was around the time of the Stirp study. There have been a few expositions again more recently, but it's most of the time it's not on display. In fact, it's particularly, I think that they're trying to protect it, get the image against light, because what would tend to happen, you see, is that as you expose the shroud to light, particularly if there's any daylight involved in that, then the contrast between where the image areas are and where there aren't image areas would gradually become less, because the ultraviolet does tend to cause that yellowish discoloration of a cloth, which is what we can see. In contrast, that there's more of that discoloration where the image is and not where it isn't, so to speak.
Okay. So I've always wanted to see, and it's maybe get a road trip from Blog Talk, complimentary road trip if next time it's on display. Hopefully, be seen. I just found this whole subject to be really fascinating. So, how did we're building up to the evidence that it was indigenous to the Holy Land, but how did the shroud end up in northern Italy?
Yeah, well, it's basically there is evidence, as you say, linking it from the pollen studies to the environs of Jerusalem, and it's thought that following that it may have gone to a place called Edessa. There's a story of a king, King Abgar, who was very unwell, and who was sent a message to Jesus, asking, having heard of Jesus's ability to heal people, saying, can you come and heal me, sort of thing, and that he couldn't. He was busy, of course, with what he was doing at the time in Judea, and but he said, somehow I'll try and help you. And it said that although he didn't physically go there, that his burial shroud, which had his image on it, was taken there, and it said that this king was was healed when he came into contact with it. And then it seemed to be hidden away for some time there, because there was this notion that any image of a human being was considered in some cultures to be something that you shouldn't have, so to speak.
Okay.
Although there may have been an exception in the case of the shroud, once it was realized that this wasn't a so-called graven image. It hadn't been made by hand, so to speak, and it just appeared on the cloth, in which case people might have had a more tolerant attitude to it. But then it appears that it may have been taken from there to Constantinople, where it was actually possibly looted by the Crusaders, and that could be how it got to France, which is actually, it was from France that it got to Italy. Now, of course, many people got put off by the carbon dating that was reported in 1989 in Nature. I was actually studying for what's known as an intercalated science degree during my medical degree when that paper came out, and so in I used to read Nature every week, so I happened to see it when it came out, this radiocarbon dating report. And even back then, I noticed when there's a little corner where they've got the statistics in a table there, and there was a discrepancy there, because if you compare the results of the different laboratories that tested it, then a statistical test would imply that there was very little chance that they'd actually dated cloth of the same age. In fact, you could say at the 95%, as they say scientifically, 95% confidence level, that they probably didn't. And it was actually some pioneering work by a couple in the States, Sue Benford and Joe Marino, who actually found evidence that it was actually the part that they chose to do the dating from was a corner of the cloth that had been one of the most damaged over time, because of course it would be at the corners that the shroud had been held when it was on display, and of course there was always the temptation for curators of the shroud to break little bits off to sell as relics or whatever, and it appeared that it actually been a reweave had been done to mend it at some time where this damage had been, such that there was actually more modern material in that corner than there was actually the original material. Now, one of the scientists from Los Alamos, Raymond Rogers, who was a chemist at Los Alamos Laboratories, he when he looked at the shroud, he said, there's no way a forger could have made this. But then, being scientific and so on, and wanting to believe what the evidence said, at first when he heard about the carbon dating, he thought, oh well, maybe it is medieval if that's what we have to believe what the science says. But he heard Benford and Marino were suggesting it was a reweave that had caused this mistaken age, that the part that had been tested wasn't representative of the rest of the cloth. And so he said, well, I've got he still had some samples left from near the corner that had been dated, as well as from other parts of the shroud. And he said, well, I've got the material to prove these, called them fringe people, to prove them wrong in 5 minutes. And so he did the test, and then he went on record and wrote a paper in a peer-reviewed scientific journal called Thermochimica Acta, as well as recording a video before he died, to say that I set out to prove them wrong. I've ended up proving them right, because he found that it was chemically completely different. The corner that had the radiocarbon dating was completely different to the rest of the cloth, and so many of us have been sort of lobbying the church to try and get another carbon dating done, but to no avail so far.
Okay, so let's see. So we might as well just start talking a little bit about some of the evidence that you've already brought up. Like you've mentioned a couple of times the pollen found on it. The pollen does date to like a March-April time period. So that would fit in with like the Easter time period.
Or Passover as it was then. Yeah.
Right. And a little earlier, you mentioned that this person seemed to have lived between 6 BC and
between 6 and 66 AD. The reason for that is the reason for suggesting that is because, generally speaking, of course, this man whose image we see on the shroud and whose blood we see on the shroud was a victim of Roman torture and crucifixion. And usually, when the Romans crucified people, they left them to rot, basically, for the wild animals and birds to get at their flesh and so on. The idea was for it to be a deterrent to everyone not to go against Roman law. But there was there's evidence that the man whose image we see on the shroud was in an area known as Judea, which was an area under Roman occupation. But there was a sort of figurehead, if you like, who was a Jewish leader there as well, and to keep the peace, the Romans agreed to allow the local people who were mostly Jewish to be able to keep their customs. So the Romans didn't stop killing and crucifying people, but they did at least let people give them the burial according to their traditions, which, as many people know, in the Jewish tradition is supposed to be a burial very quickly after someone has died. And so the fact that this was a victim of Roman crucifixion who was buried quickly, and the reason why we know he's buried quickly is because although he must have been dead when he was wrapped in the shroud, and we know that because otherwise it would be completely covered in blood if he'd still been bleeding, but there is some blood stains on there, which means, according to some empirical work that was done by a Dr. Gilbert Lavoie, a physician in Boston in the States, it must have been within about a maximum of 2 hours after the body had died, after the man had died, that the body was wrapped in the cloth. Because after that, even in humid conditions, the blood will have dried too much to allow transfer of stains onto the cloth.
Okay, and you also make an interesting point about the limestone dust that was particles that were found on the shroud as well.
Although I'm a bit cautious about how much weight I attach to that, but there is, because there is some suggestion from some research that was done that the limestone is characteristic of Jerusalem limestone, although that particular, there's plenty of other evidence that does put the shroud to have been there, but I just wasn't totally convinced that those researchers had done what we call in science sufficient controls, that they had samples from enough places to say that, okay, it does look like Jerusalem, but if we compare it to other limestones, it's very different from them. So it's not enough just to say it looks like Jerusalem limestone. You have to show, if you want to say it's from there, that it's not like limestone from other places. And as far as I could tell from that, they hadn't shown that very strongly enough, or they may have seen it, but not put enough of the evidence in their paper, which is tantamount to not having demonstrated it really fully. But I don't rely on that particular piece of evidence to locate the shroud there. There's plenty of other evidence that does.
Okay, well, you do say it's preliminary evidence, but it is interesting to look at that possibility. And we're also talking about the microscopic, like pollen molecules as well that were found. It's just really interesting how. Science has detected.
Yes. Well, there was a book by a Professor Avinoam Danin, who was a professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who wrote a book called Botany of the Shroud, and he sort of presents the evidence presented the evidence in his book that if you triangulate all the pollens that were found on there, it does point to it having been exposed to the elements in or around Jerusalem in March or April. Yeah.
Wow. I might. That sounds like another book we're going to have to get.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, and can you explain the oxidation and the hydration aspect of the
basically that's what happens. That's what makes paper turn yellow when it's exposed to sunlight, oxidation and dehydration. And when the chemical studies were done on the surface fibrils of the linen, it appeared to be the same thing that has happened there. That's what causes the image. So it's known as accelerated aging. You know how if you leave paper long enough, it will turn yellow from sunlight or ultraviolet light. Well, in this case, the being exposed to this radiation from the body of the man has, for a tiny fraction of a second, has made that sort of sudden change in the outermost fibrils of the cloth.
And Andrew, you brought up this point that I did not realize, that there's actually a second shroud in Spain.
Well, not a shroud. There's something known as a sudarium of Oviedo, which has blood stains on it. It has no image. It has blood stains on it that many people think. Some good work was done on this by Robert Guskin. That actually, if you fold it around a head of a man, then the bloodstains that are on the sudarium seem to many people to coincide with the bloodstains that you see on around the head of the man of the shroud. So many people believe that may have touched the same individual, and that was the last time they could have come into contact. The shroud and the sudarium was at least as early as around 1600 years ago, and probably in or around Jerusalem. So it does, it's just yet another piece of evidence that points to the shroud being that much older than the carbon dating.
I was not aware of that one until I read your book, and I was like, oh wow, it's kind of like a related piece of fabric. That was really cool to read. So from the images of the man, it's almost like a crime scene investigation where you're drawing our attention to like the blood stains going down the forearms to the elbows. Can you tell us a little bit about what all that means as we examine the body as it is dying?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it all is consistent with the fact that it runs throughout the recently deceased body of a man who had been tortured, whipped, and crucified, and it shows that the blood was coming not as you see on paintings and so on from the hands, but actually from the wrists, and this is what we know from which wasn't known in medieval times, but we do know now that the hands wouldn't have been able to support the weight of the body, so it makes sense that it would have been the wrist, and again it was Dr. Lavoie who drew my attention to the fact that there are what's known as off-image stains. So there's a blood stain that's near the elbow, but not actually coinciding with the image of the elbow. And this, when you think about it, would be consistent with the fact that there are two different events here. One is that the formation of the bloodstains, which is a simple contact process when the body of the man was lying flat on his back after he died, and the shroud was wrapped around him. And there's a second process that happened whereby the image was formed, and that was sometime after he had died. And now at that time, it looks as though the cloth is actually stretched out and flat in a planar aspect in front of and behind the what would have been as I explain in the book, the vertical body of the man when the image formed. And so, for example, you have the bloodstains that would have been from the side of the face when the cloth is stretched flat, as it were. They're superimposed on the image of the hair. And this is the fascinating thing, that it looks as though that when the image formed, the body was no longer lying flat on its back, but was somehow upright, and strange as it may sound, was actually suspended in the air, upright, because the hair is going straight down. It's not going behind the body. It's going straight down onto the shoulders, and the muscles of behind the back and the buttocks and the calves and so on are not flattened as they would have been if he'd been lying down supine. And yet, if you look at the position of the feet, they're not at the same level. So it doesn't look like he was standing. It looks like he was upright and suspended above the ground. And now, this is the amazing thing, because this has only become apparent using 20th and 21st century technological research methods, and wouldn't have been known about in medieval times, for example, but is amazingly consistent with anecdotal reports of what happened during the lifetime of Jesus of Nazareth. For example, reports of him walking on the water, and of him being seen to rise above the ground, and his shining like the sun at some points, according to reported witnesses. Now, that's the fascinating thing, that not only does the evidence sort of archaeologically, forensically, and historically point to it having been this in particular individual. We see on the physical evidence on the shroud that these events that were described to have happened during his lifetime, that may have actually been real. Maybe it actually did happen, because it looks like it happened after death as well, that something amazing happened to the body of the man. And you see, the rest of the first two chapters of the book talk about the physical evidence regarding the shroud, but then I go on from there to say, how was such a thing possible? Because for me, it's not enough to say, oh, it's a mystery, or it's a miracle, or whatever people want to call it. You see, that people think that everything where mind affects matter, they call it supernatural or magic or whatever. But to me, that doesn't really make sense to think in that way, because if you think about it, if we have such a thing as freedom of will, which, we all live, whether we notionally believe we do or not, we all live our lives assuming that we do and assuming that others do. Otherwise, why do people deserve credit or get blamed for things that they do wrong if they were going to do it anyway? We consider that people make free decisions what they're going to do with their mind, which means that their mind is influencing matter. Otherwise, how can they make free choices? And of course, then there's the evidence from quantum physics that mind is actually fundamental. It's not a derivative of matter, but that matter only takes on reality because of the observer. Now, there's a very eminent professor of physics at Stanford University called Andre Linde, who was so convinced by the evidence that consciousness must be fundamental and had to have played a role in making space-time and matter happen, that he actually wrote a section on this in his textbook that he wrote, which is the leading textbook on inflationary cosmology. And there's an interview that he did where he mentions that at the time he included that, his publisher said to him, if you put that in your book, you might lose the respect of your readers and your colleagues. And he said, if I don't put it in, I'll lose my self-respect. And then there's Eugene Wigner, is a Nobel laureate quantum physicist, one of the leading, who was when he was alive, one of the leading researchers in quantum physics, and he put in writing that basically, how can we possibly think that consciousness doesn't influence matter when all of our experience from science says that if there is an influence from A to B, there has to be one from B to A as well. That if we know that matter is affecting consciousness, then consciousness must be able to affect matter. And so, I mean, so many people assume that science is, that people who know the evidence from science will become materialistic and assume that we're just lumps of flesh and piles of atoms and cells. But actually, a lot of people don't realize it's the science itself that points beyond that and says that a human being is far more than that, and a human being is something of greater significance than all of the galaxies and physical objects that you can see when you look out at the universe.
Okay, and you cover some of this space and time and separate. We're kind of getting into the quantum physics part of the show. Can you explain what you mean by that? Like the separation and.
Indeed.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Well, I mean, basically, if you think of the near-death experiences, and when people they're in cardiac arrest, their brain waves are flat, and often one of the first things that people perceive during that time is this immensely bright light, and they have this sense, this knowledge, as they described it, that within that light is all knowledge and wisdom and all compassion, that they somehow feel loved by that light, and that the people that they care about are somehow in that light there. Now, you see, this is fascinating because if you read the writings of Professor David Bohm, who was also a quantum physicist, he made the point that to light, and this is basic relativity physics now, that at the speed of light, that the distance and duration of time become zero. So if you could be a light beam, according to Einstein's equations, which have been proven correct in so many different ways now, if you could actually be that light beam, then you would get to where you're going instantly, and there's no distance to where you're going. In other words, light joins together points that appear to be separate in space. Now, if you think about it, space is just simply another word for separation. you don't have space unless things are separate, and you can't have separation unless you have space or room for that separation to be. So it would make sense then that light, if you like, is the interface between our separate state as individual beings and our full potential. If we all became completely limitless and reached our full potential of perfect wisdom, if you like, there'll be nothing to demarcate the difference between one person and another. And I think that's what Jesus was alluding to when, he said, love your neighbor as yourself. That fundamentally, at a fundamental level, your neighbor is yourself, and that within that light that people experience in near-death experiences, which may be, in fact, the same light that produced the image on the shroud, through how the body changed as a result of how that man had lived. Within that light, we're all one, and so that's why the way of living that he spoke about of forgiving, loving your enemies, it's not a religious thing at all. It's simple reason and sense. It's the most rational way to be, and that in this physical universe, everything is being broken apart by something that physicists call the second law of thermodynamics. Everything goes into greater and greater states of chaos, but we have something. There is some component of us, if you like, as living sentient beings that has no beginning or end and needn't break apart. And the clue to how that can best be preserved is by it not being fragmented and broken and becoming lesser by separating in selfishness, but through recognizing the limitless value of all other beings and ourselves. If we really live out of that recognition, then even our atoms themselves might change, as the atoms of the body of the man in the shroud changed when the image formed. And so basically separation is if you like, a consequence of ignorance, of us not having that wisdom, and each of us having our own patterns of restriction that mark us out as individuals. And that if we undo those knots, those restrictions, those limits, through recognition of the value and grandeur of all sentient being, and live out of that recognition because of that recognition and in what we do and how we are, then we needn't be bound in physical bodies. Basically, there's a lot of evidence that I allude to in the book that lots of people, when they have those NDEs, that they say that they weren't able to become part of that light, and of course they came back to their bodies because they were resuscitated. But had they not come back to their bodies, perhaps I believe there is something to this rationally, this notion of reincarnation, that if we don't become fully that light, if we still have shadow and limit and restriction, then that plays it out in other incarnations unless we learn and are able to undo those restrictions, and then we come back again. So it seems to me that basically what the man of the shroud was showing us was how we can avoid needing to keep coming back into this physical universe where everything's breaking apart and there's so much suffering and decay and so on. As he said, that this is a world where there's moths and rust and thieves that break in and steal, but there's another way of being where there is no entropy, where there is no second law of thermodynamics, where you are eternal. And again, that's not a platitude, it's not a religious thing. This is reason, this is sense, and this is now 2,000 years later is backed up by science.
And Andrew, you were just talking about going into the light, and probably made more famous with Poltergeist and Carol Ann, don't go into the light, that scene. But you do cover that those who have experienced the near death experience, that they when they return to consciousness, that they experienced a sense of empathy, and that's going to be one of our topics next week. But that making a sudden realization, having that overpowering feeling does fit in with what also with what you're saying with the love your neighbor. So those couple little topics that you just discussed does go back to the possibility that the shroud, the shroud really may have been the one that did enclose Jesus.
Oh yeah, well, I'm convinced of it by all the evidence that I've looked at. Yeah, but it was.
Okay, and I'm just looking over my notes here, and what are the implications of the evidence on the shroud for our understanding of the concept of reincarnation, and well, there's also reanimation as well with this shroud topic.
Well, I mean, if you look at what was reported about what the Jesus of Nazareth spoke about during his lifetime, then some of it is to be found in, for example, in Gnostic Gospels and so on that weren't included in what we know as the New Testament, but also even within the New Testament. There's an interesting conversation that's reported where Jesus is asking the disciples who people say that he is. And someone says, well, some people say that before the Messiah comes, then Elias or Elijah has to come back. And Jesus is reported to have said to them, well, I tell you, he did come back and you didn't recognize him. And then the text says that they understood that he was talking to them about John the Baptist. Now, that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because how would Elias have come back as John the Baptist unless they accepted, or unless he'd already told them, or that he did consider that the notion of reincarnation was true? In fact, all major religions have at some point had that as part of their belief system, that reincarnation is a real thing. And it sort of makes sense just from a logical point of view that it would be. But he was actually, I think, showing us a way that of a way of being that would have the consequence that we can avoid having to come back, if you like. Although, there's still, of course, the possibility that perhaps, like he did, if you didn't need to come back, but you still cared, maybe you would still come back because you'd want to, help the other people who are left behind, so to speak.
Okay, and since we're talking about reincarnation, you do make the interesting point about REM sleep, and right. However, we only tend to remember the dream if we wake during that particular instance of REM sleep.
Yes.
How, that seems to be a little bit more evidence there of the uniqueness of this person who formed the image on the shroud.
Well, I mean, I was basically in that little snippet of the book that you mentioned, I was sort of making some speculations about why it might be that we don't that people don't usually remember past lives, but people who have remembered them have often been people who were died suddenly and often violently during the life which they remember, and then somehow they bring that memory into their next or subsequent life. And the ones where people have there's been many documented cases where children, for example, remembered the person that they used to be, and they've remembered very specific facts about them, and that they couldn't have possibly known about in their current lifetime, and it's been verified. And usually, it seems to be when they previously died in the life before, sort of suddenly and unexpectedly. So I was just sort of speculating maybe that's the way that memory works. That, for example, with dreams, that in sleep laboratories you find that you will remember the dream if you're woken during it, but there are many other dreams that happen during the night which you don't remember. That was all. Although, of course, I just have to be careful that I'm making it clear that I'm not suggesting that. In fact, I put this in my final chapter, which is what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that life is just some kind of mirage or a dream. Unfortunately, it's very real, and the suffering that that many people on Earth are going through, poverty and so on, is a very real thing. But in terms of the question about dreams was just used specifically about looking at how memory works and how that might relate to how memory might only under certain specific circumstances be carried over consciously into future life.
Yeah, and those phone calls were not from the Vatican. It was more related to mom needing a gallon of milk, but
I see.
I'll take care of that shortly. But so much has been focused on the front of the shroud, but really, you're about the only author that's gone into a lot of detail about the back of the shroud, which that's just as interesting with the whiplashes across the back, and as well as the large contusion.
I think actually lots of other people have written about the image of the back of the body as well. I think where this book is different is that I'm sort of suggesting a way that might tie in how the image could have formed with a suggestion to consider about how mind and matter might be related, and what this might tell us about ourselves as human beings. And also one of the other main themes of the book in the modern day, where science and technology appears to be going headlong towards trying to develop artificial intelligence and all these crazy ideas of so-called mind uploading, that people who have lost sight of any sense of eternity beyond the atom, and so they want to try to upload their mind into a machine. And I'm just sort of making a rational, cogent argument in the book why that's not possible, that you can't, that we are not made of information. You can't make a person into a string of ones and zeros. That won't be you. And it's very dangerous. In fact, many very learned people, such as, for example, Stephen Hawking, and also Lord Martin Rees, is the professor of astronomy, who was the Astronomer Royal in the UK, has made the point that actually, if what he calls the period of what we know as organic intelligence, and by organic it means sort of living biological beings with intelligence, may be quite a short time, that once we develop technology, that it won't be long until we are actually replaced by machines. People often say to me, as a doctor, because I'm a medical doctor, they say, of course, one day people won't be going to see human doctors anymore. They'll just go and see machines instead. And I point out that sadly, it's not just the doctors that would be replaced by machines; it's the patients as well. That it's actually that people like Hawking and Martin Rees have said that if we had contact from extraterrestrial being, it would probably not be living biological being, because as soon as you get advanced technology, it's not long until there is no living being anymore, until the machines and the technology that you make actually replaces you. And it's not through any malice or because it wants to cause you harm, because it's not capable of malice any more than it's capable of compassion. It's not capable of any emotion. It's just that it's an unanticipated consequence. But a lot of science writers have said, for example, that you program these androids to try and prevent all human suffering. And of course, the simplest way for a machine that has no sense of conscience or meaning or value or purpose, that the simplest way to prevent any form of human suffering is to wipe out all human beings, because if they're not there, they can't suffer. But the people programming them wouldn't think of that. So what a large part of the book is pointing to the dangers that are inherent in following the technological path, unless we need to always be cognizant and remember what a human being is and why that is so vital and valuable. And only through recognizing that and recognizing our own value and the value of all other living human beings, it's the way that we might be able to prevent what is otherwise going to be the very rapid, in sort of generation terms, a very rapid end of our species. In fact, one of Martin Rees's books was called Our Final Century, referring to the 21st century, in which he says, are there really going to be living human beings anymore in the 22nd? No, it's up to us really as human beings to not to allow these transhumanism, uploading, and all this kind of silliness to hold sway in our world.
And I do think that humanitarian view does come across in very plainly in your book, and it's just backed up by some of the parables as well. We spoke about like love your neighbor, and a couple other ones similar to that.
The interesting one about that, of course, is you said love your neighbor as yourself. That at a fundamental level, your neighbor is yourself. That where we come from, as originally as living sentient beings, we all have the same source originally, and we've just become much more distant and divided and limited and restricted, so that we're no longer reflecting that origin that we all had. But if we were to recognize that, if we were to recognize, like you said, is it not written, "You are gods"? That's the potential of any human being, is, whether they're a king or a pauper. Every single human being has the potential to be of far greater significance than the whole physical universe.
Yeah, and another parable that you worked in from Matthew chapter 24, verse 27 says, "For as the lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be." And in the passages covering the suddenness of lightning, directions.
20 centuries ago, how would he have explained to people that when he came back after he had died, that it would be a burst of light from his body would happen? The only burst of light that they would have known about, remembering they didn't have flash bulbs in those days,
right,
was lightning.
Yeah.
And so that's a very simple way that he could have got across to them. Perhaps he was describing the moment that the shroud image formed, and perhaps that was the moment that he did come back.
Yeah, and that does fit in with this burst of energy, leaves the singe on the fabric, and the what I thought was really fascinating point that you bring up is the images that we see were done in a two-stage process, and you touched on that.
So the bloodstains happened shortly after the man had died, and then the image formed sometime after that, and at that point it appears that the body was vertical. It's not quite a singe. Although it's very bright and intense, it's a much gentler process than that, if you like, because the surface fibrils are not actually burnt. It's just they have it's like a tan, if you like. It's the effect of the sudden. It's a very intense, very short burst of ultraviolet light, not sufficient to burn through the cloth or to burn it at all, but just that if you leave the cloth out for years in sunlight, it will turn yellowish. But all of those years of sunlight, if you like, happened in a few billionths of a second. If that's the best way to imagine it, that there was that sudden, very, very bright burst of intense radiant energy that went forwards and backwards from the body of the man that was wrapped in the shroud, and that may be what he was alluding to with his description of the lightning from east to west.
Right, and the tanning that you're talking about does not penetrate through the blood stains. You bring up that point. Okay, I'll start, correct me then.
Yeah, it doesn't penetrate through the bloodstains, which is interesting, because that it shows that in fact it doesn't penetrate through the fibers. It's only on the very outermost surface fibrils, because the bloodstains are opaque to ultraviolet light, and even the fibers of the linen are only allow it through a tiny distance, 1/5000th of a millimeter, before they also absorb it. But that's the fascinating thing, is that because there's no image under the bloodstains, it means that the bloodstains happen before the image, which means that the body was already dead before this event happened that formed the image.
It's just fascinating. So it was done in 2 stages.
Yes. Well, any dead body, if there's still damp blood stains on it, if you wrap it in something, then blood stains will form on the thing that you wrap it in. So that's a simple process that is not really in dispute. But the important thing about it is that the specific forensic aspects of the bloodstain do tie it in with this one individual in history of Jesus of Nazareth, and the terrible tortures that the Romans did to him, the Roman soldiers, and the crucifixion and the cap of thorns and so on, and even the fact that he was stabbed in the side as well. It's also, there's forensic evidence of that on the shroud. But the unique thing as well is the image formation, because there's no other object that's ever been found, in archaeology that has anything like this image, and nobody, no matter how much they've tried, people like Gala Shelley and so on, and they've mostly been honest enough, actually, to be fair to them, to say that, when people say, but if you look at it microscopically, it's nothing like the shroud image, and they do mostly sort of admit that. Well, they have to, really, because it's blatantly apparent to anyone who looks.
Okay, and since you just mentioned the stab wound, what was there was unusual substances found near.
Yeah, it looks like there's a clear fluid that mixed with the blood, and which may have been what we know sort of anatomically as pleural fluid, possibly, which is what you would expect from a stab wound that's puncturing the pleural cavity, which it would have done. Which the pleura is just a membrane that sits around the lungs and the diaphragm of the body, between the chest and the abdomen.
Okay, so that's consistent with the when Jesus was stabbed with the spear that water came out.
Yeah. So it would have looked a little bit like water, because people that because it's a clearish fluid. Yeah.
Okay, and bring in more of the science is that as you discuss the radiant energy, you also work in the Bose-Einstein condensate. Can you explain that for our listeners? It's an interesting phenomenon to interject.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, Bose-Einstein condensate, basically what that means is that in quantum physics you have this thing called entanglement, where separate particles or can be in some way connected together without being in physical contact, so to speak, so that this is things that people can look up and read about. So, for example, the processes like a superconductor, or something that's known as a superfluid, which is something that that basically all of the molecules or atoms move and function together without resistance. So a superfluid can rise up above the wall of a vessel and so on that it's contained within, and superconduction, the electrons pair up and they move through the superconducting material without any electrical resistance, and so that the several different parts can all function together. So that basically we're trying to understand how, you see, for a long time it was thought that these quantum processes of large amounts of material all functioning together, that only happened at very, very cold temperatures, when you take out the shaking, if you like, of all the thermal movements of the molecules. But it has been found that there are certain biological processes, for example, the ones that allow birds to navigate, and even photosynthesis and various other things, where it shows that at the body temperature even you do get sort of processes happening in such a way. It just seems that I explain in more detail in the book, but it's not, you don't need to sort of study a lot of physics to get to grips with it, but basically that I'm trying to understand how the body, which was horizontal when the bloodstains formed, and how it came to be vertical at the moment that the actual image formed, all as a piece, as it were, that the whole body together was. See, there's a process known as tunneling, which whereby a quantum particle can get through a barrier that it shouldn't be able to get through. It's not, strictly speaking, it doesn't get through, but it starts off on one side of it and it ends up on the other side of it, because it's not actually quite a solid object as we think of it, like, you know, this old idea of atoms and molecules as little round objects all tied together, that actually it's mind that gives it reality. But until it's actually observed, if people want to read up about the two slit experiment, for example, that an electron or a photon can, as it were, go two different ways as though it were going two different ways at once, to be able to explain what we find about it. And a similar sort of process may have been at work at the time around the time that the Shroud image formed.
Okay, so as we've examined, a little bit of the dying process, and the near death experience. Bring up that if consciousness is eternal, like, where were we before we were born, and where are we going afterwards?
Yes. So basically, the point that I make in the book is that, and this is something that Schrödinger himself, one of the founders of quantum theory, alluded to, that time is actually a product of consciousness. That all the equations of physics, none of them actually account for why there should be a now, a present, like as we experience it, or a so-called flow of time, the sense that the past has happened and the future isn't there yet. That in the equations of science, it's as though the whole thing would be there altogether, but it's the observer, it's the consciousness that makes that time happen, that makes there be a now. And it follows from that if we make time, then time didn't make and cannot unmake us in terms of our consciousness. So in other words, we have no we have no beginning nor end. And by we, I don't mean our physical bodies that we now inhabit, as it were. I mean the stream of consciousness that we're now experiencing in this moment now, as I'm talking to you and people are listening, and I'm listening to you, and so on. So basically, we didn't begin, and we need not end. And in terms of where we would have been before, well, it seems to me to stand to reason that there has to be an explanation. I've always of how we come to be how we are, and people talk about the nature and nurture debate. Well, how much of it is genes and how much of it is our environment. But I've always said that to me it's more like nature, nurture, and a third element, which is actually neither of those two things. And that neither may be partly what we bring in from our subconscious memory, from what we've done and experienced perhaps in past lives, together with the choices that we're making now, because some of what we do and what we are is a product of course, of the choices that we make. And those choices that if we live in a way that the man of the Shroud was demonstrating, then perhaps if we were able to do that enough, then we need not be part of this cycle of coming back and dying and coming back and so on. But as long as there is limitation and restriction, as long as there are things that divide, like selfishness, materialism, racism, all the things that make us smaller, if you like, as human beings, less than our full potential, because we're not able to learn from our fellow man to be able to form a sort of wisdom that is all-encompassing. And if we were to do that, then we wouldn't perhaps need to come back. But if as the ignorance that we perpetuate will tend to mean that we do need to come back. Of course, that relies on there being somewhere for us to come back to. And of course, if the trends that are happening now technologically and so on, in terms of transhumanism and this vogue for what people wanting to try to develop mind uploading, there may not be anywhere for us to come back to, in which case then we're stuck. We don't stop existing, but we don't actually have anywhere, where to be born, as it were. So all the more reason why we need to value humanity and its potential in all human beings, and to recognize that there's something in everyone, however, whatever their background, nationality, religion, race, whatever, that is bigger than the universe. And that's why I think that's basically what people like Jesus, not just him, the Buddha and other great teachers, like people like Muhammad and many other people in history have been trying to say that we should recognize and value all human beings, and if we do that enough, then our future is secure. That's what Jesus was, I think, referring to as eternal life.
Okay, and taking the eternal life theme a little bit further, you also cover the Big Bang theory, and that's you have a little bit of everything in a burst of conscious light. How does the shroud almost seems like a mini recreation of the Big Bang?
Well, I think, some people say that. Now, I don't see it quite like that myself. The Big Bang is, if you like, the beginning of separation, the beginning of space, time, and matter, and I'm fascinated by what's on the other side of that singularity, if you like, where there's no matter, space, or time, and that's where I believe this state of being that has no limit, that Jesus, I think, is what he was referring to as the Father, if you like, that the state where we are all completely without limit and in complete wisdom and compassion, and that the big bangs happen as we become less than that as we become limited and restricted, and then you start to have matter and force. Whereas I talk about in the book about what I call the mind matter continuum.
Mm-hmm.
That basically matter is a construct of force that is only as Heisenberg said, that matter is basically a world of possibilities and potentialities. That's all it actually is, until as the quantum theory shows, it's actually consciousness that makes it actually real in interacting with those possibilities. But matter is a derivative of enforcement. And what we have as sentient beings is we have freedom of choice, okay, which is, if you like, unenforcedness, if you like. That the free choice is the one thing in this universe that isn't determined by something outside it. So it's what I refer to in the book as primary causation. And the more restricted we become, the more materially derived we get, and the more we lose the potential of what we could have been.
That's a lot to think about. And it just seems this unlimited potential seems like that's what we have at this moment, where the person goes from a supine position to it's not really a standing. You're draw attention to the feet as well as hair hanging straight
down on the shoulders.
And the calves and the back aren't flat. So it's just all this. It's like one movement from supine to a floating position, and you get the burst of light, and and it seems like this person, whether it's Jesus or I don't know who else it really could be, but there's just this message about living, a free will. Just there's some kind of powerful message about there's an infinity still ahead of us. Can you tell us, like, the meaning of the feet while NSA and the Vatican calls again?
Well, I'm not really it's not so much a meaning of the feet, just that the position of the feet suggests that the body was upright and floating above the ground, as strange as it may sound. That's what the physical evidence suggests, that's how the body was at the moment that the image formed. And Now, the interesting thing is that in the sort of reported history of the particular individual, Jesus of Nazareth, where it said that he walked on the water, that this friend called Peter is also said to have walked on the water. And the most fascinating thing about that is that it said that at one point Peter started to sink when he started to doubt that he could be doing what he was doing. Now, that seems to imply that somehow that the orientation of mind acts, if you like a valve that allows or disallows this. And I think the best word for it, and the word that Jesus himself used, is peace, that allows that peace into that unenforcedness, which can actually lighten the very atoms of the body, such that it was possible for him to be walking on the water. And this idea of doubt and so on is just the restriction that we're not allowing that peace into us.
Okay, this is just really fascinating. So, and we've spoken a lot about the front and some of the back of the shroud. One of the parts of the body that really isn't covered is the top of the head.
Yes, because the image of the front and back of the body is, if what I'm suggesting is correct, that the light was basically emanating in one axis, if you like. If the body was vertical, I call it forwards and backwards, the light. It wasn't going upwards or sideways. So that's why where the top of the head is, what you can see on the cloth there, between the image of the front and the image of the back of the body, there's just a water stain there. There is no image of the head, exactly as you say, and that would be in keeping with this notion that I'm suggesting, that if the body was aligned as the force within it was being undone, and it was lining up in the gravitational and magnetic force lines, and then releasing the light that came from it in the third axis. So if you like, there's the up-down axis from the top of the head to the feet. There's the north-south axis, which is effectively the left and the right, and then the light that emanated from the body is going east and west. Hence what he said about that when he came back, it would be like a bolt of lightning that shines right from the east into the west.
Amazing. The story of the shrouds, this burst of energy does not. You're making it sound very plausible. But we also have other cases of spontaneous combustion. Charles Dickens mentions it in Bleak House. That's a whole nother topic. I didn't want to get sidetracked in that, but people. There have been a few documented cases of people just
it's quite a different thing, and I think it may be a physical process that's going on there that's not really necessarily related to the mind of the individual who was tied. There have been some scientific research on this spontaneous combustion process, whereby it's to do with the way the fat in the body combusts, like the wax in a candle. But there's a whole other topic. But it's not really related to what I'm saying about the shroud image, which is a completely unique thing, and it was not formed by the body burning, and it wasn't a scorch. And when I said like a tan, I didn't mean literally like a tan. I just meant that as a tan is the effect of the ultraviolet light on your skin. So the yellowing of paper, or the yellowing of the linen is the effect of ultraviolet light, but not from the sun, but from, in this case, a body that shone brighter than the sun momentarily for a tiny fraction of a millionth of a second. And so, if you like, the equivalent of many years of direct sunlight, but just like that, instantly. But not sunlight, but this was light from the body, different type of light altogether.
Okay, so and you can rule out, or we can rule out based on the scientific evidence now that Leonardo did not paint this. It's not any kind of medieval forgery.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, and how does the church view this artifact, relic?
I mean, they don't really have any definite statement about its veracity or not. They say that that's for scientists to determine, but they unfortunately they're not allowing the scientists the access to it to do the necessary further testing that many of us are arguing should be done now that the carbon dating has been called into question because of the area that they used for the dating. That there could be a further dating from other parts of the cloth to see what the age comes out as, because there's way too much evidence pointing to it being far earlier than the date that the carbon dating gave, and the carbon dating just doesn't hold up when you look at the fact that the corner that was tested is chemically totally different to the rest of the cloth.
Okay. It's always like those medieval stories about, we do find some examples in like the Canterbury Tales with real relics, faked relics. It's really a fascinating subject.
Of course, for it was only relatively recently that it came to the possession of the Catholic Church. It was in the for the quite a while in the after it come from Jerusalem and Constantinople and then to France. Then it was in the possession of the Savoy family, and it was the Duke of Savoy who bequeathed it to the then Pope in his will. So I mean, to me, it's a piece of scientific evidence rather than a relic. It's an archaeological artifact that tells us a great deal about ourselves as human beings and what our full potential could be.
This subject may not pertain directly to the shroud, but we have the shroud, and it's also documented in the Gospels. But have you looked into the ossuaries that were?
I've heard of them. Yes.
There seems to be a little bit more evidence that there was, Jesus' family buried in the Talpiot tomb. And now we have the Shroud. It seems like when the Crusaders came back from the Holy Land, they had knowledge of something. It just seems like there that with the Shroud of Turin, well, and the one in Spain, that there is more evidence of that there was a real person named Jesus.
There's plenty of evidence that he was there. Even if there hadn't been the Shroud, he was actually mentioned by historians of the time. In particular, Josephus refers to him. Yeah, so there's plenty of evidence that he was there, but that he existed. The Shroud tells us that that there may what was reported to have happened to him in terms of the Roman torturing and crucifixion that actually unfortunately did happen, but that also that after that something magnificent happened as well. That somehow the reports of the people who, having seen him after he had died, that he'd come back and spoken to them, that that we now, if that body got up off the rock and the slab and suddenly shone brighter than the sun, and that maybe he did come back as he said he would, and that he did actually meet those people and speak to them as they said he did.
Okay. We have about 9 minutes left. Your book, A Burst of Conscious Light, is going to be available next
week.
Yeah, next Tuesday. So, do you have any public appearances, conferences coming up, or?
Well, on my website, lightoftheshroud.com, are a couple of the presentations that I've done at conferences. One was the Shroud conference in St. Louis, and there's another one, a talk I gave to the Society for Scientific Exploration in San Francisco about what I've been talking about today, about the mind matter continuum, and how this fascinating subject of how time may be a product of consciousness, and how that may show that we are actually, as sentient beings, that we have no beginning or end, and how also again about the dangers of the technological drift into transhumanism and this silliness about people trying to upload their minds, and in that talk I explain how such a thing isn't possible, that you can never reduce mind to a string of ones and zeros. And if you look at the evidence from the light that formed the Shroud, then that shows you how the full potential of how we're so much more than just that, binary, mechanical, electronic, technological stuff. That really matter is merely a byproduct of consciousness, not the other way around. That consciousness is our sentience is eternal, and the more that we recognize that, value ourselves and each other out of that realization, then there may be a chance for humanity to avoid what many scientific commentators have said is likely to be the end of our species through the unanticipated consequences of technology.
Yeah, and you have a number of publications on the Shroud, but in your the references section in your book, you have 15 pages or so of references, a bibliography. It's like you're researching all different aspects of the Shroud and recreating the time period, like the Jewish law about crucifixion. So
of course it was the Romans who did the crucifixion, but it was the where the Jewish law at the time was relevant is about the practice of burial and how it doesn't look as though the body that was wrapped in the shroud had been washed, and that was because he was buried according to Jewish law at the time. Yeah.
Yeah, and you have it's not that long of a book, but it's a comprehensive view of all the research that's been done so far. I think it's just a fantastic book, eye-opening to the microscopic research, like the pollen, to connecting it to all the quantum physics.
Basically,
you did a terrific job.
Thank you. The shroud and the fact that the person who it wrapped formed that image is, as I say, a clue to the nature and potential of all human beings. So in a way, it's a book about the reader and the people around them. It gives an explanation for how we can understand what we are as human beings, what the nature of our consciousness is, and what its full potential is. That we are effectively eternal being that has become caught in a physical form, but that we've been shown that there's physical evidence from the shroud that if we live in a certain way, that we needn't be restricted to being, if we don't treat people as material objects, if we recognize and respect and cherish the humanity of mankind and preserve that, then we needn't follow the drift of the second law of thermodynamics that will destroy us if we let it, and if we accelerate that through that destruction through technology. It's giving a reason why not to try and upload yourself, why not to try and implant chips in you. Say that your humanity is much bigger than anything that technology can give you.
We don't need any more of the second law of thermodynamics. We need just more empathy, like you suggested, and we're down to 90 seconds or so. Andrew, I want to thank you so much for being our guest. Let you get back to holiday, and I just want to recommend to the audience when a burst of conscious light becomes available next week. Just get a copy. It's really a eye-opening book, and Barbara, do you want to step in and wrap up the show?
Absolutely. This is, definitely a book you're going to want to read, because it does finally begin to link science with spirituality, and he has a very profound, compelling case here. and makes it palatable for both venues to kind of merge into one for a period of time. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening. Thank you to Dr. Silverman and, of course, Mark for bringing it all to us. Definitely, this is one book that I'm going to be perusing rapidly. Check out our calendar and take a look, see what's coming up Monday and Tuesday of next week. Also, check out the YouTube channel, and if you like what you see and like what you hear, please subscribe. Bye, everybody, and thanks so much for sharing your time with us.